Hello and welcome to the Practical Animal Channel. The channel is for you if you want to know what it takes to work with animals. Wild species or domestic. With wild species they could be free living or in a collection. If you want to work with domestic species, those could be agricultural or companion animals. Whatever your animal interest, we aim to cover it all. This week my guest is Ian Redmond, and he is a great ape conservationist, and he will be talking about the skills and personal qualities needed to work as a field biologist with great apes. So that could be with gorillas, chimpanzees, or with orangutans. He's got the experience. He started out working with Diane Fossey in Central Africa and then went on to become a great ape conservation ambassador for several major organisations, and he joins us now. Ian Redmond, welcome to the Practical Animal Channel.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Ian, please can you describe your career from the beginning to date?
I'm laughing because sometimes people use that word career, and that isn't a term I particularly associate with what I do. Basically, stuff happens and I try and keep up, and I fail dismally sometimes. But it is, yeah. I've been interested in animals all my life, and working with them since before I graduated. So it's sort of a career. The kind of the nutshell description I use is I think I'm a naturalist by birth, having had a lifelong interest from my earliest age in all living things. A biologist by training, because I figured there's not many careers just being a naturalist. So I needed an ologist. I needed to be an ologist of some sort. And biology is all life, and all life interests me. So that's why I studied that. And a conservationist by necessity. In other words, that wouldn't be my career choice if it wasn't necessary, but it is so necessary that, yeah, it's on two occasions I've set out to do some really interesting research and found that individual animals that I'd got to know were killed by poachers, who from this distance I can see were working to a different agenda that was entirely reasonable to them. So I don't want to demonize poachers, but when you see animals that you know and have come to trust, and they trust you, and so I would go as far as to say that those were interspecies friendships, where two beings, one human being and one non-human being, hang out together because they get on. That's, to my mind, a friendship. And when someone kills your friends, you want to do something about it. So my motivation comes from a very difficult place, the loss of individuals that I knew, but it's become a lifelong career, if you're going to use that word, simply because I haven't finished yet. But my ambition is to go back to being a naturalist and enjoy studying and filming and photographing animals with a half decent chance that they'll still be alive when I've finished the project.
Fantastic. Didn't you spend your early years in Central Africa with Diane Fossey?
Well, my early professional years, yes. I had the good fortune to be born in Malaysia, which is, a biodiversity hotspot, and what a wonderful place to be born as a naturalist. But as I always say, only half in jest, I was kidnapped as a toddler by my parents, who brought me to England. I grew up in Yorkshire, and Yorkshire's got some fantastic natural history, and I grew up indulging in every aspect of it, up to my knees in swamps, looking at frogs, and of course, like every small boy, taking them home with me and keeping them in jam jars and watching them develop and sadly often die, because small boys aren't terribly good at keeping wildlife in their bedroom. So from that point of view, I was a predator of tadpoles and caterpillars, although with caterpillars I did better. I kept them to maturity and watched them pupate and then emerge as a moth or a butterfly. And that is, it's a wonderful phenomenon, and to see that up close. But now I guess I'm more encouraging young naturalists to go and lie on the grass and watch in situ, so that you're not acting as a further predator or a force against the dwindling biodiversity that we have to study. So yeah, traditionally naturalists were collectors, and I was a collector as a child, and I collected all sorts of things, not terribly well from a scientific point of view. I didn't have a mentor who could teach me about labeling and keeping a diary and a log and so on. That came later. But to go back to your question, yes, while I was an undergraduate at Keele University in Staffordshire, lovely campus surrounded by woodlands and lakes, and so a great place to be a naturalist. I took on the role of organizing speakers for the Biology Society, which is a fantastic thing to do if you're at a university or a college. Get involved in organizing the talks, because you read about someone who's doing interesting work and you write to them and say, would you like to come and give a talk? And they say yes. And they come. In those days it was coming. Nowadays with COVID, perhaps it would be talking down a tube like this one. But yeah, I invited someone who had been studying gorillas for his PhD and was then writing it up at Cambridge, Sandy Harcourt, and put him up in my flat overnight after his talk, and picked his brains and got the address of the research centre, and wrote to Diane Fossey, this American, I say biologist, she was not by training a biologist, but she had become the world authority on mountain gorillas simply by being there and studying them, and convincing grant-giving bodies that she was the right person for them to fund to do the research she was doing. And she needed assistance, and I was lucky enough to be taken on as her general dog's body. So that's what I was doing between 76 and 78, and then again a bit in 80.
Whereabouts were you born in Malaysia, if you don't mind me asking, as somebody who's got a passing familiarity with Malaysia?
Okay, I was born in Kluang in Johor. And Kluang translates as the town of the flying fox. And it wasn't until many years later that I finally got back to Malaysia to see where I was born. And as a lot of Malaysian towns that have a name that is relevant to an animal, the roundabouts have models of the animals. So you go to Kuching in Sarawak, and the roundabouts have cats, because Kuching is a town of the cat. And when you get to Kluang, there's a roundabout, and there's some sticks with model fruit bats on the roundabout. So yes, but sadly the forests that were basically at the bottom of our garden when I were a lad are now all oil palm plantations, and you have to go quite a long way before you find natural habitat. And that has been sort of, yeah, that's the period we're talking about. The past 60 something years is the period of rapid deforestation in much of the world. And you kind of have to take your hat off to these countries that were once almost all forest, just as the UK once was. And it took us, 300 years to convert our wooded landscape into an agricultural landscape with a few little pockets of forest here and there. And they've done it in 3 decades, 4 decades, gone from almost completely forested to patches. And what the wildlife of those biodiverse countries is now trying to survive in is almost the equivalent of copses and hedgerows that link the patches of remaining habitat in the UK. And that's fine for dormice and squirrels if they're not being hunted, but for orangutans and elephants, how can they survive in little pockets here and then a corridor to get to another one with human habitation on either side? So that's the real challenge that conservationists are facing today in the 21st century, is how to live in a way that's compatible with biodiversity. And not just because it's nice to have all these interesting animals around, but because that's the planet's life support system, the ecosystems containing and comprising, you have to make that a clear distinction. Ecosystems don't contain animals, they are comprised of animals and plants and bacteria and fungi and all the other organisms that make up that functioning ecosystem. And these ecosystems provide services to every one of us. So whether we live in Yorkshire or in Malaysia or in China or North America, we are dependent upon these complex, interdependent ecosystems that we trash at our peril. And you and I have, during our lifetime, have seen the number of, not just the number of species, but the number of individual animals be reduced by roughly 2/3 overall. And that's kind of scary, because whatever work they were doing in the ecosystem, there's only 1/3 of them doing it now. And in some species, it's down to 5%. So the number of elephants gone down by 95 or more %, number of gorillas, number of chimpanzees, number of orangutans, all down to a tiny fraction of their former number. And whilst we say, oh yes, well, we have to ensure that they survive, if that means a sort of population of a few hundred, enough to maintain genetic diversity in a patch of remaining habitat, they might survive. But it's a bit like if you were a factory owner and you had a factory with 1,000 employees, and then 950 of them got laid off or were killed. And so you've got 50 employees, you're not going to have the same output from your factory. And when we're talking about ecosystems, that's how we need to be thinking. Yeah, they're wonderful species, they're fascinating, we like them, and especially if they share DNA with us, like gorillas and orangutans and so on. But they're not ornaments. They're not just interesting things to study when you want to do a PhD. They're part of the life support system that we all depend on. And that's why this year especially, it was supposed to be last year, 2020 was supposed to be the super year for nature, where we redefine our relationship with the natural world. And before we got to that, nature bit back with the virus. And although the origins of the virus are still being debated, it has shown us what can happen if nature is abused. And the more we abuse nature, the more likely it is, I think, that emerging diseases like the COVID-19 and all the other preceding new and emerging diseases which have been documented over recent decades, that's going to get worse. And our life is going to be more and more uncomfortable. So 2021 is now the super year for nature, and the Convention on Biodiversity is meeting in China, and the climate talks are being held in Glasgow, and the IUCN Congress is running right now in Marseille in France, and all the political leaders and the corporate leaders and the NGOs are saying about we're needing a new relationship with nature. Meanwhile, the Western governments are still, I understand, subsidizing fossil fuel production with huge subsidies, which, if applied to renewables, would transform that industry and create lots of new green jobs, but it hasn't happened yet. So slowly, little incremental steps. So it's kind of crunch time for nature. And whoever's watching this video, if they want to get involved in that effort, don't just think of becoming a professional conservationist. Whatever you're doing, whether you're an accountant or a lawyer, keep a part of your mind focused on nature, because we don't want to be a little silo of full-time conservationists talking to themselves. We need every discipline on the planet to be aware of the need to take biodiversity, nature, ecosystems into account. Otherwise, we're not going to turn this ship around.
Have you been to Dundee Valley Field Centre in your capacity as a professional naturalist, Ian?
Not yet, no. It is high on my list. No, I have been to Saba a number of times. I've been to the Kinabatangan Valley, and I've been to some of the locations that would excite a naturalist, but not yet Dundee Valley.
Ian, what are the skills, experiences, and personal qualities that have contributed to your success?
Well, again, that's presuming that there's been some success. Well, I guess that the important skill for a naturalist is patience and the ability to be alone, sometimes for long periods, or if you're with a friend, keep quiet. It's amazing how many people who are really keen to see wildlife can't stop talking when they're in a wild area. And so they don't see much wildlife, because animals are attuned to human voices and will probably do their best to avoid them. So yeah, being comfortable with your own company is useful if you're in a remote location studying something and you're on your own. At the same time, being able to get on with other people, particularly if you have differences of opinions, and find a way around those differences if you're in a small team in a remote location. And not all natural history happens in remote locations, but if you go on an expedition, or if you go and work in a field study center in the middle of some wonderful wilderness area, the chances of social interactions are much reduced. So the interactions you do have, whether it's with yourself or with one or two or three close colleagues, you've got to be able to get on. So patience is probably a key quality, and curiosity. I often talk about the 3 C's of human nature. The first one being curiosity, because we all want our children to be curious, we want to encourage that. And then when they take an interest, especially in animals, you want them to be compassionate. You want them to be kind to the animal. And if they're in any way interacting with it, do so respectfully. That might just mean keeping a distance. But if an animal needs rescuing, obviously you want to help it. And if you spend any time with animals, the 3rd C of human nature, comedy, comes up, because animal behavior can be hilarious. And it's such fun to watch them. So the comedic potential of some of the situations you find yourself in as a naturalist, you're reaching out with your hand inside a plastic bag to pick up a pile of gorilla poo, and the gorilla turns around and does a double take. And what is the human doing today? It's all right. Very good reason for doing this. Try it, label as specimen, take it back to a microscope. So yes, curiosity, compassion, and a comedic sense are all very helpful. And I guess most people in academia would say an aptitude for passing exams. That wasn't one of my strong points, so I didn't go into academia. I do give a lot of talks in universities, and I guess one of the reasons why those often go down well is because I'm not just talking to the high flyers, I'm talking to those who are struggling to get through and saying, look, there's still a role for you in this business of saving the habitable part of the planet. We don't just need the academic superpowers, we need the people who are just passionate. So people who really care. I'd rather have someone who has a lousy degree and really cares, I'm in that category, than someone who has a first-class degree and it was a toss-up whether they did biology or some other subject, because they didn't quite know what they wanted to do with their life. And so when people often ask me, well, how do we get into this business? I mean, I usually suggest you go to a place that really interests you and get to know it. And very often, especially that's a place that's difficult to get to, by spending a few weeks or months there, you become a world authority on that place. And you can then have conversations with people who might be in a position of sort of academic eminence, but they haven't spent several weeks in that location. They don't know the local people. They don't know the local problems that the wildlife or the ecosystem are facing, and you do. So getting some first-hand knowledge and then applying it, because then you can apply for a grant and say, well, I've been there for 6 weeks. This is what is really needed. And people will be impressed by that more than I'm sitting at my laptop in England, as I am now, saying, I'm aware of a problem on the other side of the world. If you'll just give me some money, I'll go and look at it. That's less of a compelling story. So having a bit of initiative and getting to somewhere where you perceive a problem, and that might be down the road. If you're in the UK or in Europe or North America, there are plenty of biodiversity problems on your doorstep. And the more you study them, the more you'll be in a position to say, no, I've seen this with my own eyes, and that empirical evidence carries a lot of weight, even if you haven't got a PhD and a associate professorship in a university.
That was brilliant, really inspiring. Thank you, Ian, for that. Ian, what 3 books, people, and or meetings have most influenced your thinking?
Ooh. Books, people, or meetings? Well, I was once asked by BBC Wildlife to say which was the most influential book, and I was sorely tempted to list a mighty tome I had as a boy called Nature, Earth, Plants and Animals, which was full of really good science, and I spent hours poring over it. But possibly, and I was honest in the BBC Wildlife article, possibly more influential was Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan and the Golden Lion. Because at my junior school, there were kind of 2 groups of kids. There were the very large group of kids who played football at break, and there was a much smaller group of kids who climbed on the climbing frame and hung upside down and swung. And I was always into climbing, and remember sitting on the climbing frame, sometimes hanging from the climbing frame, reading my very battered paperback copy of Tarzan and the Golden Lion. And the way Edgar Rice Burroughs describes rainforests, he'd call the big old trees mighty forest patriarchs. And that's such a wonderful image. And he described how when Tarzan got into the forest, the thin veneer of civilization was shed and he was back being an ape in the forest. And we're all apes. And some of us are more in touch with our inner ape than others. I guess I've been in touch since childhood. So it was beyond my childish dreams to find myself working in a research center studying gorillas and then finding that the gorillas were actually in danger and they needed someone to tackle the poaching and cut the snares and protect them. And whilst I wasn't necessarily the best equipped person to do that, I was part of that movement, which since the mid to late 70s, when things were looking very bleak for mountain gorillas as a subspecies, Diane Fossey feared they would be extinct by the end of the century. By the time the end of the century came, their numbers were actually year on year growing. So here's a critically endangered subspecies of gorilla that we've turned things around for. And now, 20 something years into the 21st century, their numbers continue to rise. And it's a state of execution, because if we don't tackle climate change, then rainfall patterns change, then their habitat will become arid and they'll die anyway. Because all the projections for the Earth at 3 or 4 degrees warmer are that the tropical forest zones in Amazonia and Congo Basin and in Southeast Asia will become arid. So all that wonderful biodiversity and all the ecosystem functions that those forests provide for the rest of the planet, evapotranspiration, pumping water vapor into the atmosphere and watering crops and filling aquifers and powering hydroelectric schemes all over the world, it would change, and not necessarily for the better. So we really have to do more than we have been doing. But amidst the general doom and gloom of conservation news, the mountain gorilla story was, whoa, wonderful. We've turned it around. Their numbers are increasing. They have a chance. And that's now, we have to apply those lessons to other endangered species. But one of the keys to mountain gorilla conservation success was ecotourism, because it turns out that people are prepared to pay a lot of money to get rained on, get muddy, get scratched, get stung by nettles, to sit a few yards away from a family of mountain gorillas. And that sharing of the wonder of that moment, which for many people, they first realized it was possible when they saw Sir David Attenborough, although he was just David then, he wasn't knighted at that time, sitting surrounded by gorillas and them interacting with him. And most people were just gobsmacked by that. Most people never thought it conceivable that a television presenter could go and film gorillas and not be, a long way away filming with a massive telephoto lens, but sitting next to them to the point where they actually played with him. So that bit of footage did a great deal to fascinate people. And that fascination translated into, year after year, tens of thousands of people trekking to Rwanda or to Uganda or to the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo to sit respectfully. It used to be 7 meters. Now, because of COVID, it's been increased to 10 meters distance from a family of gorillas. Of course, that depends on long haul flights, mostly. Not many people are going to go over land to Central Africa. And as we start to look at our personal carbon budgets, and mine's been the worst of most people I know because of all the travel I've done, whether it's to do field work or to go to conferences where we're trying to protect nature, and yet to get there, all the delegates have to fly. Not everyone has friends like Greta Thunberg has, who have a transatlantic yacht that can take you across the Atlantic to address a conference. So the idea that we can save all the endangered species by taking people to see them on holiday is I think it's misguided, partly because of the carbon budget problem, but also partly because it encourages people to think these are just interesting animals you go and see on holiday. And what we want people to understand is what they're for. What do they evolve to do? What role do they play in the ecosystem? And how can we restore that role to its former glory, now just a few stragglers hanging in there? And that, I think, has to be the new focus for our relationship with nature. And that's why I'm really excited that perhaps one of the most influential people that I've worked with. I guess Diane would be one. She was my mentor, and she introduced me to mountain gorillas, and she introduced the world to how to win the trust of wild gorillas. That was an amazing contribution way beyond her scientific discoveries, which were considerable. But last November, I started working with someone called Ralph Shami. And Ralph and I and a chap in London called Walid Al-Sakaf, who's a businessman. He's become the CEO of the company that he and Ralph and I have set up. But the reason that Ralph is so inspiring is because, well, he's not a naturalist. I mean, he's interested in nature, but he's an economist. And I've never had much truck with economics, because if you study economics traditionally at school or university, they will tell you that the economy is sort of central to human endeavor and nature is an externality, which to any naturalist is just nonsense. No, nature is the foundation of everything we do. But Ralph has turned this on his head. And if he had expounded his new economic paradigm, which is to value living nature rather than dead nature, if he had done that just in a journal of economics from a university somewhere, it would have been discussed in meetings of economists, and maybe it would get into some scientific meetings where people were discussing this. And I've been to these meetings for decades where people have talked about payment for ecosystem services as a way to fund the conservation of nature. There are very few places in the world where it has worked. Costa Rica is one of them, the Catskills, New York is another, but the examples are few and far between. And Ralph has come up with this paradigm, which he published on the IMF website, because for the past 23 years, he's been working at the International Monetary Fund. He's now the assistant director. And when he talks about a new economic paradigm, people sit up and listen. And this is wonderful. And it turns out he had watched my TED talk when I talked about gardeners of the forest. And then another influential person that's come into this story, just in the last few months, this has started to happen, and it's going to, we think, change the nature of the world economy. Not that I want to be too ambitious, but that's what our goal is an Italian biologist called Fabio Bazzaghi. And Fabio studied two forests in the Congo Basin, one where there were forest elephants doing their thing, and one where they'd been extirpated decades ago. And it turns out the forest with elephants has about 7% more above ground biomass, which these days you translate into, carbon. Forests are full of carbon. There's 7% more carbon where there are elephants, and everyone's looking for nature-based solutions to climate change, then restoring the elephant function to forests which are still standing but haven't got elephants would make them more efficient at sequestering and storing carbon. And that, in the post-Paris Climate Agreement world, and leading up to COP26 in Glasgow, or if you're watching this after November 2021, at the COP26 climate talks in Glasgow, the details of how the carbon markets are going to work are being hammered out. And so our goal is to make it possible for companies that want to, they want to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and they can do some of that by being more efficient and changing the technology, but the big changes in transport and in industry are going to take time. So in the intervening period, if they're going to balance their carbon budget, they need to offset their carbon emissions by increasing their uptake somewhere else. How wonderful to protect elephants as a way of increasing carbon uptake in the forests of Africa, and we hope in South and Southeast Asia. So that's what rebalance.earth is all about. It's Ralph Shami, Walid Al-Sakaf, and yours truly, trying to change the global economy. And there's a lot of other people involved too, of course, most of them at the moment as volunteers, trying to get this idea off the ground. But once we have a proof of concept, which we're planning to do in Gabon, which has more forest elephants than any other African countries, we think it will quickly be replicated elsewhere and rolled out to other species and other habitats on other continents too. And that could be very significant because it will make the planet more efficient. It will put money into nature, to invest in nature. And as Ralph is fond of saying, this isn't a short-term project, it's in perpetuity. because he calculated, and this is where the exciting bit comes. So this is possibly the most influential paper I've read. He calculated that over the 60 or so year life of an African forest elephant, he or she is responsible for the additional sequestration of $1.75 million worth of carbon. Just let that sink in for a moment. At the moment, a living elephant in a forest is worth nothing unless someone kills it. And then you can sell the front teeth as ivory, or you can sell the meat, or you can sell the skin or the tail hairs. We have all sorts of inventive uses for bits of dead elephants, but no one's ever paid for what a living elephant does. But if you think of those elephants as like the factory workers in the factory, and we've lost 95% of them or more, let's protect the ones that are left and allow them to recover in number so that they can continue playing their role as mega gardeners of the forest. And if that results in more carbon being sequestered and stored, use that carbon finance to not only protect the elephants, but to help the communities that live next to the elephants have a better life that isn't dependent on some organized criminal gang coming in and saying, I want some strong lads to carry ivory, I'll pay you a couple of $100. Because it turns out that 1.75 million divided by 60 years is about $80 a day, each elephant. And I think once that word gets out in villages in Africa that protecting living elephants can actually improve everyone's standard of living more, then the next time a criminal syndicate sends somebody in to get some poaching assistance, they're going to say, get lost. We want our elephants alive, thank you very much. And so will the store owner, who under the counter probably has a box of ivory waiting for the next dealer to come through. Oh, wait a minute. If I'm doing this for dead elephants and they're only worth a few $1,000s, and alive they're worth millions of dollars, because the 1.75 million was at the price of carbon 2 years ago, and it's more than doubled since then. So you can see where this is going. Living elephants, and Ralph's first calculation was for the great whales. And each whale is responsible for the sequestration and storage of about $2 million worth of carbon, because whales fertilize the phytoplankton with their fecal plumes in the oceans, and that phytoplankton produces about half the world's oxygen. So again, I'm quoting Ralph Sharmy, every other breath you take, thank the phytoplankton, and the whales that fertilize them with their fecal plumes. And in the forest, it's the elephants who produce roughly 1 metric ton of dung per elephant per week, which is fertilizing the soils and allowing the big trees to take up more carbon from the atmosphere, using the nutrients from the elephant dung that fertilizes the soils. So it's exciting stuff. And that's why I would rate Diane and Ralph and Fabio as the three people at the moment who are the most influential in making this happen. And I don't know about the books. It might mean that the depiction of Africa that Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote about, having never been to Africa, he just read other people's books, might live on. It's romanticized, it's a lot of tosh in places, but it certainly gets a lot of young people interested in adventure in Africa, and maybe that's a useful thing too.
Ian,
sorry, there's rather long answers. We're never going to get through these 10 questions in.
Ian, what was it like working with Diane Fossey? What was she like?
Diane was, I think, the polite way of saying it was a complex person. And on a good day, she was wonderful. She had a wicked sense of humor and was often very playful. But on a bad day, she had a fiery temper and a very rich vocabulary. And if you were in the firing line, then you knew about it. No, she was, a difficult boss, as I and the African staff knew to our cost. But she was an inspiring person. And it's true that some people were inspired by her because they saw that what she was doing and thought that they could do better. And some of them have. And some people were inspired by her because they wanted to emulate what she was doing. But she was a product of her time. And many of the things that she did would not be appropriate today. But she was kind of holding back the tide. And luckily, because of her example and the articles written about her and the films that were made about her, many other people followed. And collectively, we have turned things around for mountain gorillas. But eastern lowland gorillas, the other subspecies in the eastern gorilla species, are still declining. Western lowland gorillas still declining. Cross-river gorillas still declining. And then, of course, across Africa, chimpanzees in more countries than, there's 10 countries with gorillas, 21 countries with chimpanzees, most of them declining. Bonobos only found in one country, declining. Orangutans, we now know that there are 3 species, Bornean, Sumatran, and Tapanuli, declining. So we've got a long way to go before we can say, oh, we've cracked it for ape conservation, but at least with mountain gorillas, we did get it right for the period that followed the traumatic events of the late 70s when I was at Karasoke. And I think some of those lessons can be applied to other populations. But I think the payment for ecosystem services, particularly for the services that can be attributed to individual animals, so that you care about the individuals, that I think is going to be going to play a growing role in the future of conservation of these species.
That was brilliant. That was so inspiring. Ian, what is your view of great ape conservation today?
Well, my view of great ape conservation today is that it's been too little and in many cases too late. And it has focused on methods which some of them are no longer applicable. So great ape conservation is largely about leaving them to their own devices. Humans always want to do something, they want to intervene. And very often it's the absence of intervention that will solve it. And if there is an intervention, it's to control human destructive behavior and leave the apes alone, or whatever species you're talking about. Generally speaking, their behavior and ecology have evolved over millions of years. And if they're left to their own devices, they'll do a grand job. And we can learn by observing them, not by doing stuff to them. But the human impact on ape populations can involve killing them for food, because ape meat in some societies is regarded as either a delicacy or having some sort of semi-medicinal properties or magical properties. So we've got to stop doing that, obviously. Destroying the habitat, because the habitat is full of wood, and wood has a value when it's chopped up and made into furniture. Living trees don't have a value yet, but we're working on that. So I think the future for ape conservation is seeing apes as the gardeners of the forest, and elephants, and spider monkeys and tapirs in Latin America, whatever the species are that disperse the seeds and prune the trees and thin out the small trees. They're the ones that are making the forest most productive. And when we start seeing these species not as interesting study animals or something nice to go and see on holiday, both of which they are, I've studied them, fantastic. I take people to see them on their holidays. It's fantastic, but that isn't the primary purpose. So I like ape conservation to move more towards understanding the role that apes play in the ecology of ecosystems that sustain us all, so that everyone realizes that protecting apes isn't just the interest of a few weird scientists who want to study them, but it's actually part of our own self-interest. We want a planet that is habitable. We want those forests to continue playing the role that they play in climate stability and rainfall generation and so on, and recognizing that each population of animals, down to the individual, is important. And I say down to the individual. I just recently prepared a paper for a court case in Indonesia, where an individual orangutan was taken from the forest and kept in a zoo illegally. And I said, well, one orangutan is likely as an adult to live for at least 30 years, every night building a nest. When an orangutan builds a nest, they fold leafy branches together to form a ball into which they make a sort of like a giant bird's nest, which from the point of view of the forest canopy is a bit like folding an umbrella. So that spread out canopy of leaves is brought into a tight ball. So you're creating a light gap. And what apes do, either during the night or when they get up in the morning, is relieve themselves of the contents of their bowel, which was yesterday's mostly fruit. So orangutan poo is full of seeds. So they've been taken miles from the parent plant, dropped on the forest floor, under a light gap in the canopy, surrounded by fertilizer, because the dung, of course, forms manure, and the seedlings have been germinate because the seeds have been scarified by the teeth of the orangutan and deposited in a packet of fertilizer under a light gap miles from the parent plant. So optimum germination. And that role hasn't been calculated, what the value of that role is. But if that orangutan did that for 30 something years, that's more than 11,000 light gaps. And each night's droppings would have hundreds, perhaps, of seeds, depending on the size. Smaller number of big seeds, larger number of small seeds. So if they've been feeding on figs, there'll be thousands of them. If they've been feeding on durian fruit, there'll be very few of them. But anyway, seed dispersal agents, gardeners of the forest, that value of an individual orangutan life has not yet been calculated. We're working on it. And that, I think, is what people forget when they see an orangutan suffering in a horrible cage in a zoo. They think, oh, the poor orangutan. They're not thinking, the poor forest, that 30,000 fewer light gaps, millions of seeds not being dispersed because this poor orangutan is suffering in the forest. So we want people to have empathy for the individual orangutan, but also we want them to understand the loss to the forest and therefore the loss to the global ecosystem that each individual animal taken out of its habitat is causing.
An allied question, Ian, is how do you see great ape conservation developing over the next 20 years?
Well, it hasn't. The next 20 years are going to be critical. We have to turn things around so that instead of all the graphs going down towards zero, they're rising again. And in natural habitat, not in zoos and lovingly crafted enclosures that try and give a captive orangutan a decent life. You're looking at an ape in a captive facility, and it's like going to one of those industrial archaeology museums where you see a big cog on the wall and you see it going round and round, and then you notice there's a wire, there's a motor driving it. And if it's a water wheel, it's even worse, because they've got a water wheel splashing through a little pool, making splashes, but it's not actually doing what a water wheel was designed to do. And apes are like the cogs of the forest. You take them out of the forest and it's like watching a cog go round and round in a little concrete yard. And maybe they've got a grass patch outside with a climbing frame, but it's not engaging with its habitat in the way it evolved to do. So my hope is over the next 20 years, more and more apes will be either put back into natural habitat, and for those that have been confiscated from the illegal wildlife trade, that is a real possibility. Perhaps less so for those who have been bred in captivity, but there is one organization, the Aspinall Foundation, that is putting captive bred gorillas from Kent back into a forest in Africa where they can play that role. So there is a precedent. And putting apes back into ape-depleted forests and putting elephants back into elephant-depleted forests so that the forests become more efficient. Everyone's saying, oh, we've got to plant lots of trees, but there isn't enough land to plant trees to take up the greenhouse gas emissions that we're generating. So you have to make the trees we've got more efficient. It turns out that apes and elephants and other keystone species in those forest ecosystems do just that. And that, I think, has to be the focus for conservation for the coming 20 years, because we probably haven't got 20 years to turn it around, and we need to. So that's a kind of important change in attitude.
Ian, what career advice, for want of a better expression, can you give to aspiring great ape conservationists, please?
I would give to any aspiring conservationist the advice to get involved. As Greta Thunberg has shown, persistence pays. And her Fridays for the Future school strikes for the climate campaign has gone worldwide. Who'd have thought that a teenager in Sweden could form a worldwide movement? So the time is right to get involved, become an activist, whether that's going down to your local Extinction Rebellion group and getting involved in protests that are pushing the authorities. What politicians want is to be elected. And if they feel that the decisions they take are going to be unpopular, they'll be reluctant to take them. So whether or not you're involved professionally in conservation, tell your political representatives that they have your mandate to take tough decisions. because they won't do it if they think they're going to get kicked out of office in 3 years' time. And we want them to be making plans for 20 or 30 years' time. So yeah, get involved. And that can be writing a letter to the local paper. Certainly find out who your MP is if you're in the UK, or your MEP in Europe, or elected representative anywhere in the world, and tell them what you think, because their job is to represent you. And if you don't tell them, they can't really do that. So get involved, and get involved practically, because wherever you live, there will be a conservation project that could probably benefit from your muscle. If you're helping to clear invasive alien species like rhododendrons, I cut my conservation teeth at Keele University, organizing gangs of students to go out and cut down rhododendron bushes, because that's a very beautiful Himalayan species, but it completely denudes British woodland hillsides of their natural biodiversity. So we need to take out the alien species and allow regeneration of natural forests. The big thing in the UK is rewilding. And there are many farmers that might be prepared to rewild a corner of their land and just haven't got the money to pay someone to do it. So volunteer, go and talk to a local farmer, not as an enemy, but as a potential ally of conservation, and say, hey, look, there's that corner over there. Let's enrich it for nature, and then see if we can join it up by restoring some of the hedgerows that the government's been funding farmers to take out for decades, and put them back so that there's connections between. So connectivity is an important theme in conservation, and that's important not just in terms of local habitat, but globally too. One of the hats I'm proud to wear is as an ambassador for the Convention on Migratory Species. And I kind of point out to people that here in England, we naturalists like to think of cuckoos as a British bird. And they're harbingers of spring. When they arrive, we all write to the paper, say, oh, we heard a cuckoo. Not so many these days because their numbers have declined. And part of that decline is because of farming practices in the UK, but part of it is because their habitat in Africa, where they spend the winter months rubbing proverbial shoulders with gorillas and elephants, that's also been destroyed. So keeping the flyways of migratory birds and the pathways of migratory species open so that the animals can move in the way that nature intended them to, and especially important as climate changes, because the conditions that are right for them are probably going to mean their habitat will move. And if there isn't a corridor, how can they keep up with the slowly moving habitat, because the rainfall patterns are changing or the temperatures are changing. So we have to think this through. And the other most unconservation friendly or naturalist friendly term that I would throw in here is land use planning. Get involved with the people on your council or your government that are involved in land use planning. Because if they haven't considered the biodiversity implications, if they've just had a sort of rudimentary environmental impact assessment and say, right, let's tick that box, let's get on, build whatever it is, then they could be creating a problem for the future if they haven't considered the migratory routes of birds or other animals. So yeah, it's get involved. That's the most important thing.
What do you see as is the role for zoos, if any, in great ape conservation, Ian? I mean, for example, what's the best enrichment for apes that are in captivity?
There you get into a real ethical dilemma. I have visited hundreds of zoos, often with behind the scenes tours, and the keepers I meet are amongst the most passionate people who care about apes on the planet. So my words are picked carefully, because I certainly don't want to alienate all those allies. They are people who care about apes. But the role of zoos is mostly to tell people why apes need to be in their natural habitat. And that is incongruous. You're standing in front of an enclosure that tells you how important apes are in the natural habitat, and they're not in the natural habitat. You're standing in front of a zoo with 1 or 2 or 3 elephants walking around basically a yard with whatever enrichment the very inventive and caring keepers have put in place, but these are animals out of their natural habitat. So I don't think the idea that zoos are going to keep a self-perpetuating captive population of apes into the future, generation after generation. I mean, how many generations is it okay to keep? Particularly the intelligent social mammals like apes, who I would characterize not just as animals, but as beings. You know, they have self-awareness, that they have intelligence, cognition. And when you see them behaving naturally in the wild, and you can visit my YouTube channel to watch lots of gorilla videos of gorillas or elephants behaving naturally in the wild. And you see that and compare it with the life in captivity. So despite the best efforts in the better zoos of keepers and management to make it tolerable, it is effectively a prison, and they are imprisoned for a crime that they didn't commit, because they didn't commit a crime. They're just interesting. And we are a curious species. And, you know, for many years, I was a scientific fellow of the Zoological Society of London. So I know that that society was founded to introduce the public to new and curious members of the animal kingdom. A very laudable aim. But now, you know, you can reach for a VR headset and put it on, and you're in a forest. You look around, you've got the sound of the forest in your ears, you're completely immersed. So we don't need to bring alien, you know, foreign species, exotic species to the UK. We have fascinating wildlife in the UK. And I think the future of zoo conservation in the UK is to focus on UK species. And in France, to focus on French species, because those need help too. And if people want to learn about other species from other countries, we have virtual reality, which can take them there in a very convincing way. Or we can encourage people to travel, but travel, if it involves long haul flights, is adding to the carbon burden that we're putting on the planet. So even that gets more difficult as we become more aware of our personal responsibility. But I think ultimately we're all going to be given a carbon budget, and we can choose whether we spend it or sell it. And those that want to travel will probably buy the carbon allowance to enable it. I don't know, that's looking some way into the future. But the role of zoos is education. But if what the pupil or the student sees is an animal walking around in a yard, they're learning about the anatomy of the animal, they're learning about what the label says of its natural habitat. But how much more exciting if that was a patch of natural habitat full of perhaps contained in an enclosure traditional native species. So, you know, where are the zoos that are damming the local stream and allowing beavers to behave naturally, or allowing the beavers to dam the local stream within a fenced area, but so that you're showing people how beavers change the watershed and slow the runoff, so the flooding downstream is less severe when there's a serious downpour of rain. Zoos could do so much more to help conservation where they are. And if there is funding for overseas conservation, and most zoos, if you ask them what percentage of their annual budget, which is often in the millions or the tens of millions of pounds, goes to field conservation, it's a tiny percentage. Even the best ones, it's perhaps Bristol Zoo worked it out as being about 7%. So 93% of their budget is keeping animals in captivity, very few of which are ever likely to go back into the wild. And I would say that that is not a good use of conservation spend. And I know that they would say, oh, but this is entertainment spend. This is people coming to you know, pass the time on a weekend, show the kids, get them interested in nature. And it can have that effect. And many people see their first wild animals in a zoo. But I would think that as particularly keeping tropical species in a temperate climate requires a lot of energy intensive equipment, and keeping polar species in a temperate climate requires a lot of energy intensive equipment. So as every organization starts to look at their carbon budget, these big sort of multi-million enclosures that need a lot of energy are going to seem less and less relevant in our carbon conscious 21st century thinking. Whereas the job they have in terms of being a center for conservation education becomes ever more important. So I think that's the direction the zoos need to be taking. But those managing zoos mostly are people who grew up in the last century with a very 20th century view of zoos. And they've got to catch up pretty quickly with the new generation of thinking, which I think will change that. Challenging stuff, I know.
Very challenging, very interesting, but very challenging, like you say. Thank you for that, Ian. Ian, what's the most treasured possession in your office?
Hmm. Well, it could be in a bag over there. I could get it for you if you want. There's a nice ball of elephant dung, which I take to lectures to explain to people the importance of elephant dung. Or it could be my copy of Gorillas in the Mist that Diane signed.
Oh, yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah. Ian, what's your best great ape fact, please?
Um, that they are the gardeners of the forest, or that if you grew up reading the Tarzan books and watching the movies, and you see Tarzan beating his chest with his fists, no, gorillas use an open hand. They slap the bare skin of their chest, use a cupped hand beneath the large pectoral muscle, and that produces a sort of a pock sound. So when when a silverback gorilla beats his chest, and this is silverback to the adult males, and adult male gorillas lose their chest hair. So the opposite of humans, human boys don't have hair on the chest, and then they hit puberty and they start sprouting chest hair. Gorilla boys have hairy chests, and when they hit puberty, it all drops off and they've got this dark muscular skin on their chest. And when they hit that with their massive open cupped hand, it produces a loud pock, and that's the silverback display. So that's a fact for the curious that grew up reading Tarzan books or watching movies, not with the fists, with the open hand. Get it right.
I wonder how on earth that behaviour evolved.
What an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, it's a stylized display. The chest beat isn't on its own. It starts with a hoot series and it culminates to a bipedal stance and chest beat, and then usually finishes with slamming the ground or jumping in the air and kicking or pulling over a tree or thumping somebody if they're nearby. So it's a kind of a ritualized display of strength. And I think that pock chest beat is a way of conveying that individual's strength and fitness a long way. You can hear a pock CB, a pock chest beat, from a mile or two away, depending on the weather conditions and the altitude and all sorts. But you can be pretty sure that when a silverback does that, every other silverback in the area is, because I'm sure they know each other, and they will probably recognize. And if it's a stranger, they'll think, oh, I don't recognize that chest beat, and they might go and investigate. Or if it sounds like a very impressive male, they might move in the opposite direction and avoid trouble. So yeah, it's a good question. How did it evolve?
Ian, is there anything else that you'd like to add? For instance, perhaps about your business?
I guess the most topical thing that we haven't talked about is the impact of the COVID pandemic and the measures taken to try and prevent or slow transmission, some of which I feel is highly misguided, because that has changed everything. And right now I should be in Marseille at the IUCN Congress, and I'm not. I'm interacting from a distance. And next month I should have been going to China for the CBD conference of the parties, the Convention on Biodiversity. And they're only holding a virtual one this year, and they're going to try and hold a face-to-face one next year. And people can criticize these big gatherings of conservationists from all over the planet. Well, look at the carbon budget for that. Hopefully, most of them will have offset those emissions using certified carbon credits. And although that whole process is open to criticism, it does often put money into conservation projects. So people who do fly must offset their carbon emissions and ideally choose a very conservation, biodiversity friendly way of doing that. And soon you'll be able to do that by supporting individual forest elephants to keep doing what they do to make the forest more efficient in Africa. So the impact of COVID has meant that a lot of the tourism that has been built around the revenues generated by ecotourism has suffered for the past 18 months, where there has been almost no international travel to safari parks and wildlife areas, which in the past have been funded by visitors paying to see the wildlife. That may resume. A lot of people hope it will resume, at least to an extent. But as people become more carbon aware, well, maybe that will increase the revenue for forest conservation and seagrass conservation, because when you go and visit the dugongs off Florida, you'll be paying something towards the maintenance of their habitat, which will sequester and store more carbon. So you can make that kind of work for you. But it has been disastrous, not least because many people in developing countries have caught COVID and died, or have been forced by the governments to self-isolate when they don't have a storeroom full of food. And therefore, they're vulnerable to other diseases because they're not fit. They've been left in a very vulnerable state. And I'm a trustee of the Thin Green Line, which is a charity that supports rangers around the world and the widows and orphans of rangers killed in action. And we've been trying to offer support through that charity to rangers in need, because they haven't been paid for months, because there haven't been any tourists to bring in the revenues that fund their wage bill. And that just, I think, highlights the fact that tourism is a useful stopgap, but it can't be the solution for funding conservation in perpetuity. That's why we need something like payment for ecosystem services. And hopefully, as Rebalance Earth proves how it can happen, and the part of that I haven't mentioned is blockchain, because Walid Al-Sakaf is in the blockchain world. And this is nothing to do with Bitcoin. This is what he calls enterprise grade blockchain, the sort of thing that banks use to transfer money around the world. And this can transfer the money, the payment for each elephant to the community near where that elephant lives, without any opportunity for embezzlement of funds or corruption or siphoning it off into a Swiss bank account or any other tax haven. So the blockchain element of Rebalance Earth is one which we hope is going to make it not a foolproof system. We don't want it to be foolproof. We want it to be conniving bastard proof. And there are many conniving bastards who, when they hear about the kind of money that is needed to balance carbon budgets, talking about millions or even billions of dollars, they go their ears and eyes, and they're interested more in the money than in the carbon sequestration output. So blockchain, we are hoping to prove, has a role to play to fund these projects, value living apes and elephants and other species, and restore nature. That's what we have to do. And in fact, this year, the UN has declared this the first year of the decade of ecosystem restoration. So we're going to make that happen. All of us, including the people watching this video, get involved.
Ian, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. Ian Red, very much for being on the Practical Animal Channel.
My pleasure. I've just completely changed the lighting, so it'll be hard to edit that bit, but my pleasure. Thanks for asking. And I hope people will follow some of the links that I hope you will put under the thing. And well, the ones on my email signature will do, and get involved.
Great, Ian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Bye-bye now.
This is the Practical Animal Interview.